Mike, this is when we open the show up to some fun voices from across the DMV to keep the fun and the laughs going. But today may or may not be fun for local sports fans. After Juan Soto was traded from the Nationals to the Padres, it begins a particularly dark time in DC sports history. The Nats have the worst record in Major League Baseball this season. Do you hear what I said? The worst. The Wizards were in the bottom 10 of the NBA. The Caps were an 8 seed in the playoffs and lost in the first round. And the Commanders, well, you know exactly what the Commanders have been up to. So I wanted to ask a crucial question to my good friend Craig Hoffman, host of The Hoffman Show on Team 980. Take a look. Is this the worst time in DC sports history?
That's a great question, Reese. And I just in my head went back through the decades till at least the 1960s. And I think it's at least the worst since then. And my history is just a little foggy before that. Because in the 70s, you have the Bullets who win a title ultimately in 79. You know, the 80s and 90s, the franchise under a different name, now known as the Commanders, were obviously very good. That's when they won their 3 Super Bowls and were generally competitive almost the entire time. And then since about 2000, obviously the Nats come back to town. That's exciting in its own right. And then, you know, you have the Alex Ovechkin era. So the Capitals have been good basically that entire time. The Wizards had some decent runs in there. The Commanders had a couple of seasons here and there. And now, not only have you chipped out a bunch of stars and do all the teams feel mediocre or bad, it doesn't feel like any of them ever have a particularly good path to being good again. And so I think this is about as bleak as it's been, at least in 50 years.
You know, that's a good argument that you make, because it's hard for me to say it's the darkest time when we're not that far removed from winning 2 titles. I was thinking maybe like the late 90s, where things had really started to go south on the football field. This was pre-Mike coming to the Wizards, so we had just made terrible trades to get rid of Chris Webber. We had just rebranded to calling ourselves the Wizards, which I still have never gotten over. The Caps were good at that time, but we did have no baseball team. So that was real. That was rough too.
Obviously, you're talking about a period of 50, almost 60 years when there's not Big Four because the Nats weren't here and the Senators had left. So, I mean, that in itself is also a pretty big hit for a long time for this city, is that you're one of the top 10 markets in the country. You're the nation's capital and you don't even have a baseball team. So, like, I'm sure that there are folks who are older and lived through that at a different stage of life that might make that argument as well, especially if they're fond of baseball. But also at that point, most DC natives were Orioles fans. So, like, you know, early 90s, you're out there rooting for Cal Ripken and feeling good about it. Like, that's my team, even though it's Baltimore. So I guess it kind of depends on whether you ever bought into the O's thing, too.
If you open it up a little bit wider, in the late 90s, Georgetown was still competitive, and Maryland was one of the best programs in the country, and just a few years removed from winning it all in the early 2000s. Whereas right now, we just came off an NCAA tournament where no Maryland, no Georgetown, no GW, no American, no UDC, no Montgomery College, no PG, no nobody. We've never not missed a tournament like it. We just missed a tournament. Georgetown just lost to Dartmouth. That does it. This is officially the darkest time.
It's settled.
Now, the Mystics and the Spirit have both been great recently. So how would you rate DC's support for the Mystics and the Spirit, given their success?
Good and growing. I mean, the Mystics, I've been to most of their home games this year, and they're almost full, and they do sell out pretty much every night. Of course, it's a smaller arena out at ESA, but I mean, it's a heck of a time, and I do think people are paying attention to that team. Spirit have had a really rough year, frankly, after winning the title last year, and there's a lot of, I think, structural barriers in place there that they are still working through, of getting games to Audi Field more regularly, not having to play, with all due respect to everybody watching in Loudoun County, not having to travel out there to Segra Field, which is not really a professional grade pitch. So there's some structural barriers there, but I do think it's good. I do think it's growing. I think that they are more mainstream day by day, and ultimately that's a good thing, because Reese, who doesn't want more sports, especially more good sports? And these teams are good. So it's good to have more quality entertainment options, especially considering what we just said about those 4 men's sports being the worst.
It's also good to have more quality radio hosts like my man Craig, who you can hear every weekday from 3 to 6 p.m. on the Team 980. And he hosts a fitness podcast called Train with the Best. Just check it out on your favorite podcasting platform. By the way, that show follows the Reese Waters Show on Team 980 from noon to 3. We'll be right back.